Hello, my name is Melissa Kay, and I'm the project manager at the Consortium on Gender Security and Human Rights. Normally, the person welcoming you today would be the consortium's director, Carol Cohen, but we've got some technical difficulties, and so it is my pleasure and honor to welcome you to this webinar instead, and Carol will join us as soon as the technical bugs are resolved. I want to mention that while we're introducing this webinar, the chat box is open, and we'd welcome you introducing yourselves in the chat box. After the introduction, the chat will be off until the last few minutes of the webinar, and when there will be some time to share resources and reflections. While people are still joining in, I'm going to take a few moments to give you some information about this webinar. The webinar is scheduled for 2 hours. First, the panelists will offer opening remarks, about 20 minutes each. We'll then have about 40 minutes of discussion during which the panel moderator will pose several rounds of questions. And then we'll turn to questions from the audience. So if you'd like to submit questions for the panelists, please do so all the way through using the Q&A function. At the very end, each panelist will have time for a brief closing reflection. Please also note that when you exit, a post-event survey will pop up on your screen, and we'd be very grateful if you would take a couple of minutes to fill it out. Finally, this webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be made available online on our website and our YouTube channel. As you all know, in addition to the generosity of our speakers in sharing their time with us, an event like this cannot take place without many different kinds of support. For today's panel, our appreciation and thanks go out to the UMass Boston Departments of Anthropology, Communications, Conflict Resolution, Human Security and Global Governance, Economics, History, Philosophy, Political Science, and the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies departments, as well as the Human Rights minor and the Honors College. I'd also like to thank the consortium staff and terrific interns who have been working hard to prepare today's event with us, including Katie Rose Parsons, Taylor Douglas, and Lauren Nishimura. Before I introduce today's speakers, I'd like to take a moment for a land, labor, and life acknowledgement, which I also want to acknowledge has in no small measure been influenced by the thoughtful model of UMass Boston professor Sindiso Munisi Weeks. It is central to our understanding of what the consortium's work is all about to acknowledge the land upon which the University of Massachusetts Boston resides, as an honoring of Indigenous peoples' relationship with their traditional territories, and as a recognition of the ongoing colonial violence against both those peoples and their territories. UMass Boston and its surrounding communities are based on the ancestral homelands of the Massachusetts, Pawtucket, and Nipmuc people. We want to acknowledge the violent history of genocide and forced removal from this territory and honor the diverse Indigenous peoples still connected to this land. We also note that land acknowledgements are only one small step and need to be followed by gaining more knowledge and by action building solidarity and combating the ongoing structural and physical violence directed towards Indigenous peoples. And I'll note that Northwestern University's Native American and Indigenous Initiatives website has a lot of really good resources for thinking about what comes after land acknowledgements. Also following Sindiso, I want to acknowledge that this country, like so many others, has been built on the enslaved labor of Black and Brown people, and the physical and cultural violence and white supremacy underpinning the institution of slavery are ever present in this country today, as we are reminded of by daily events. And finally, especially in this time of pandemic and the rise of already longstanding anti-Asian violence, as well as increasing xenophobia, I also want to honor the contribution of the waves of immigrants who came and daily come to this country as free choice, often when the violence, poverty, and environmental degradation in their home countries, hewn through hundreds of years of colonial and imperial relationships, has left them little other choice. All these populations have not only long faced structural racism and physical and structural violence, but also epistemological violence, the attack on their knowledges, their skills, their values, and worldviews as inadequate, primitive, inferior, just plain wrong, something to be shed in the name of progress. Our speaker series this spring and the consortium's Feminist Roadmap for Sustainable Peace and a Sustainable Planet project, of which the speaker series is part, are in part a response to the attempted erasure I just spoke of and an acknowledgement of the colonial, racist, and patriarchal capitalist knowledges, paradigms, and policies that have led us to the brink of climate and eco-catastrophe are not going to provide the solutions. We need to look elsewhere. That was the purpose of our fall symposium on confronting the climate crisis, feminist pathways to just and sustainable futures, and of our spring speaker series on prospects for sustainable peace at the nexus of race, gender, and the climate crisis. Today's panel on the climate crisis, gender, prospects for sustainable peace is the third in the series. The previous two on Black feminist ecological perspectives and on gender, race, and climate justice, national and global policy perspectives were both wonderful. If you missed them, you can find the videos on the consortium's website. And we hope you'll also join us for the final webinar, New Economic Paradigms for Peace and the Planet, Intersectional Feminist Perspectives, on April 15th, 2021 from 9:30 a.m. to 11:30 a.m. Eastern. The URL for details about the speakers and their remarks, as well as the registration link, is in the chat box. So finally, it is my great pleasure to turn over to Carol to introduce today's speakers. Thank you so much.
Our first panelist will be Kavita Naidu, who's an international human rights lawyer from Fiji, working in feminist climate justice. She worked with grassroots women in all their diversity from Asia and the Pacific to build a feminist climate justice movement. She's published a number of articles and presented widely on the gendered impacts of the climate crisis, feminist activism, economic justice, and COVID-19. She also represents the Women and Gender constituency at the UNFCCC. And recently she joined the Progressive International as a council member to work with activists, academics, and political leaders from around the world to help shape a new progressive international order centered on people's well-being. She was previously Climate Justice Program Officer at Asia Pacific Forum on Women, Law, and Development in Thailand, and she received her LLM, which is Master of Laws in International Law and Human Rights at the University of New South Wales. So let me turn it over to you, Kavita. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Carol. A very good morning to all of you from Sydney. I'll speak today on how can development justice tackle the climate and COVID crisis to ensure sustainable peace. The Global South is a region that has not developed equally to its northern counterpart. A racist, patriarchal, colonial, and imperial legacy that traded in slave labor, exploitation of natural resources, and genocide against indigenous peoples has deliberately left this region in its current state, with women and girls making up the majority of the world's extreme poor. This legacy has continued, expanded, and flourished under a capitalist system that is entirely driven by wealth accumulation and profiteering for the elites. I'll throw some figures from Oxfam's 2020 report, Time to Care, for us to truly understand what the wealth gap looks like. The world's richest 1% have more than twice as much wealth as 6.9 billion people. The 22 richest men in the world have more wealth than all the women in Africa. Women and girls put in 12.5 billion hours of unpaid care work each and every day, a contribution to the global economy of at least $10.8 trillion a year, more than three times the size of the global tech industry. Getting the richest 1% to just pay 0.5% extra tax on their wealth over the next 10 years would equal the investment needed to create 117 million jobs in sectors such as elderly, childcare, education, and health. The same top 1% is evading taxes equating to up to $200 billion. Developing countries are losing at least 170 billion each year in foregone tax revenues from corporations and the super rich. Only 25% of farmland are in the hands of farmers around the world. 75% are in the hands of corporations, governments, military, and landlords. The government spending on military 3 years ago was 1,739 billion. And in 2019, this has exponentially increased to 1,917 billion, which could have paid for the education of over 2 billion people in South Asia 17 times over. So this is the reality. of the planet that we currently live in. And you can imagine, I mean, as an example, I think it's something like, Sir Richard Branson bunkering in his underground cellar, drinking wine and playing games on his private island, while the rest of the British Virgin Islands were ripped apart by Hurricane Irma. Imagine what a fraction of his wealth could have done for building climate resilient infrastructure for the thousands of Caribbeans who have contributed almost nothing to global warming, but are losing everything to climate change. Pre-pandemic, billionaires have doubled since the financial crisis of 2017 and 2018. Their fortunes increased by 12% in 2019, while 3.8 billion people who make up the poorest half of humanity saw their wealth decline by 11%. Then during the pandemic, American billionaires saw their fortunes soar, with Jeff Bezos earning an extra 34.6 billion and Mark Zuckerberg at 25 billion. The net worth of America's billionaires grew 15% during the 2-month period to up to 3.4 trillion last year. There is no shortage of money to invest in tackling the climate crisis or the pandemic, or to invest in gender equality, education, living wage, universal healthcare, etc. The money is simply not distributed fairly because our capitalist system ensures that it remains in the hands of the elites. At a time when we are facing the worst economic, climate, and health crisis, with rising poverty, hunger, loss of jobs and livelihoods, gender-based violence at critical levels, rising authoritarianism, and weakening democracies, how is it that the elites are getting wealthier? And why are our governments and institutions scrambling to find the resources to tackle our colliding crises? Why are the governments underfunding public services such as healthcare and education? And why are the governments lowering taxing corporations and the elites? Why are public finances being redirected to military and prison complexes, or in some cases, building presidential palaces? Here, it's also important to understand the unjust international trade and investment system entrenched in our neoliberal economic model and controlled by WTO, World Bank, and IMF. This system has left the global South in crippling intergenerational debt. The aim of the trade and investment system is to liberalize trade, promote economic growth, and provide equal access to markets. What it has done instead is take 900 billion through trade mispricing, 600 billion for debt servicing, and 500 billion from trade rules accessing cheap labor and resources from the global South. Up to 2 trillion flows from the world's poorest nations to the world's richest nations. So who is developing who here? Developing nations are forced to introduce fiscal austerity, privatization, deregulation, and trade liberalization by weakening public services, eroding labor rights, and environment safeguards. The direct impact of these measures are on women and girls. As Oxfam India's CEO, Amitabh Behar, said, women and girls are among those who benefit the least from today's economic system. They spend billions of hours cooking, cleaning, and caring for children and the elderly. Unpaid care work is the hidden engine that keeps the wheels of our economies, business, and societies moving. It is driven by women who often have little time to get an education, earn a decent living, or have a say in how our societies are run, and who are therefore trapped at the bottom of the economy. Therefore, this international trade and investment system has pushed greater levels of inequality, poverty, and reverse development in poorer nations. These systems protect the global North's continued exploitation and accumulation of wealth, labor, and resources, and is the key driver of the intersecting gendered climate and COVID crisis. It reinforces the dominance and power of the global North against the global South, where most countries cannot even begin to tackle the multiple crises as long as it is being drained in modern slavery. At the global level, the very institutions that have been set up to ensure equity, human rights, peace, and development, to protect fair trade and equitably distribute the benefits, are failing to protect us from the compounding injustices. Weakening multilateralism bodes ill for achieving sustainable peace. In this region, accountability, redress, compensation, reparation, and even accessing justice for the ordinary individual at the national level is nearly impossible. As shared by Azra Saeed, a feminist activist from Pakistan, the institution of justice itself is so inherently patriarchal and very much an institution of capitalism, influenced and interfered by governments, corporations, and the military, particularly in this region. So herein lies the problem. The system is broken, and it is designed to benefit the elites at the expense of the poor and marginalized, with very little accountability for the injustices it creates. Global inequality, the pandemic, and the climate crisis all equates to some form of capitalism. So from Naomi Klein's disaster capitalism to the so-called techno-climate solutions to green capitalism, and as we are witnessing right now with vaccines, a pandemic capitalism, it's all business as usual, profit over people. So I'll now talk about climate crisis as the world's biggest threat to security by using Syria as an example. Back in the 1970s, Syrian farmers had fertile and productive lands. But since the 1980s until 2010, the country recorded its worst droughts in 900 years. This resulted in desertification and collapse of agriculture, with 800,000 people losing their income, and 85% of the country's livestock died. The country was forced to import grain and food prices doubled. The people suffered, and the droughts continued. Rural workers and farmers headed to cities, and others were recruited into terrorist groups. The Syrian war erupted in 2011. The former UN Special Envoy for Syria stated that climate disruption was an amplifier and multiplier for the political crisis that was building, and this was further aggravated by Assad's decision to reduce fuel, water, and food subsidies over the years. Water scarcity in rural areas led to ethnic tensions between the Kurds, Arabs, Alawites, and Sunnis. Despite the war almost won, the country is far from winning peace. Ravaged by war, scarce water, and destroyed infrastructure would require immense finances to hopefully rebuild a more climate resilient future by transitioning to a more energy and water secure economy, as Jamal Sagir, former World Bank director, proposes. Now, this is a dangerous reality that could unfold in our region as well. Since the onset of COVID-19, and with relentless climate and natural disasters taking place, we see rising democratic crises in Myanmar, Thailand, Hong Kong, Philippines, Cambodia, India, Bangladesh, and many others, where the military is violently quelling political dissent, toxic fundamentalisms from controlling women's autonomy to fascism, to hatred, to climate change denialism, to Islamophobia, to anti-immigration rhetoric is rife. Tech industries are colluding with governments to target climate activists, heavily control media, and surveil civil society space. There is an exponential increase in attacks against environment defenders, human rights activists, journalists, and lawyers who speak truth to power. Land grabbing, eviction of indigenous communities, deforestation and agribusiness, illegal logging and fishing have resulted in mass displacements, competition and conflict over fast diminishing resources, food and water insecurity, greater levels of environmental degradation, biodiversity loss, pollution, and waste. So there are pre-existing conditions of political instability, poverty, and scarce resources, which are now being aggravated further by the climate and COVID crisis. So what is it that we demand? In 2013, the Asia Pacific Forum on Women, Law and Development joined 92 civil society organizations from 21 countries in Asia and the Pacific to formulate a just and transformative development agenda called Development Justice that aims to reduce inequalities of wealth, power, and resources between countries, between rich and poor, and between men and women. Development justice captures 5 foundational shifts. The first, redistributive justice, aims to redistribute resources, wealth, power, and opportunities to all human beings equitably. It compels us to dismantle the existing systems that channel resources and wealth from developing countries to wealthy countries, and from people to corporations and elites. It recognizes the peoples as sovereigns of our local and global commons. The second, economic justice, is to develop economies that enable dignified lives, accommodate for the needs, and facilitate capabilities, employment, and livelihoods available to all, and is not based on exploitation of people or natural resources or environmental destruction. It is a model that makes economies work for people rather than compels people to work for economies. Social and gender justice aims to eliminate all forms of discrimination, marginalization, and exclusions that pervades our communities. It recognizes the need to eliminate patriarchal systems and fundamentalisms, challenge existing social structures, deliver gender justice, and ensure sexual and reproductive justice and guarantee human rights. The fourth, environment justice, recognizes the historical responsibilities of countries and elites within countries whose production, consumption, and extraction patterns have led to human rights violations, global warming, and environmental disasters. It compels those responsible to alleviate and compensate those with the least culpability, but who suffer the most: the farmers, the fishers, women, and marginalized groups of the global South. The final, accountability to people, requires democratic and just governance that enables people to make informed decisions over their own lives, communities, and future. It necessitates empowering all people, but particularly Indigenous and the most marginalized, to be part of free, prior, and informed decision-making in all stages of development, so that the development processes at the local, national, regional, and international levels are inclusive. So these 5 shifts provide the foundation of a new development framework that is just and equitable. There are many proposals for community-driven economies that focus on the well-being of people and planet. Some of these include the elimination of tax havens, tax holidays, trade mispricing, profit sharing, or tax avoidance, and the creation of a global tax floor. Establishment of a new democratic global and national accountability mechanism for governments, providing universal public services, universal social wage and social protections, implementation of all obligations detailed in the Beijing Platform for Action, investment in decent work, redistribution of paid and unpaid care work, respecting union and collective organizing rights, and increasing the number of workers protected by trade unions, an end to land grabbing and redistribution of land, food sovereignty and retaining biodiversity, energy and resource democracy, eliminating the use of fossil fuels, the elimination of intellectual property rules that prevent life-saving medicines, and the abolition of the free trade agreements and investor-state dispute settlements. There's an extensive list of what this development model looks like. I do encourage all of you to really look into our website at APWLD and learn more about this. So the pandemic has demonstrated the speed and scale at which finance has been mobilized under emergency conditions, which goes to prove that climate inaction has been a political and commercial choice. Governments in developed countries have poured in trillions of dollars for recovery and support measures. However, developing countries are depending on further loans, which would be disastrous given the looming economic recession. Achieving sustainable peace in the context of our current crisis necessitates the radical transformation of our failing systems, rather than look for interventions within the same systems. This has simply not delivered at the scale required for real actions making real impact on the realities of marginalized communities, and we are fast running out of time. Feminist and social justice movements globally have heeded the need for systems change, and there is increasing momentum and solidarity behind a just, equitable, sustainable, and green recovery that tackles the root causes of our crisis. Many of us are pulling our weight behind a global Green New Deal that is decolonial, feminist, and centers human rights and aligns with development justice. Thank you. Carol, Melissa.
Yeah, thank you so much. Still having tech trouble here, but that was a stunning marshaling, first of all, of the economic facts of the world that we live in. When put together like that, it just really is quite overwhelming. And then met by the scope of that, really met by the vision of what development justice would be. So thank you so much for helping us see both ends of that. I now want to turn to Dr. Bernadette Resurrection. She teaches and researches on gender, environment, and international development in Southeast Asia. She's currently Associate Professor and Queen's National Scholar of Development and Practice at the Global Development Studies Department of Queen's University, Canada. Previously, she was a Senior Research Fellow at the Stockholm Environment Institute, where she led the Gender and Social Equality Program. Her research expertise includes gender, livelihoods, socio-political dimensions of climate change and disasters, migration and displacement, and natural resource management in Cambodia, the Philippines, Thailand, and Vietnam. She's a prolific author, and apart from book chapters, scientific papers in journals, and reports, she's co-edited the recently published Negotiating Gender Expertise in Environment and Development, Voices for Feminist Political Ecology from Routledge. So it is with great pleasure and anticipation that I turn it over to you, Babette.
Thank you, Carol. Can everybody see my screen, the slides that I have on my screen? Yes?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. First of all, thanks so much to Carol, to Melissa, and the whole gender, peace, and security team over at the University of Massachusetts. Greatly honored by your invitation. I'm so happy to be here. It's quite a pleasure. My sharing this afternoon, really, and greetings from Kingston, Ontario, actually Queen's University, in the afternoon. So hello to all of you. So my sharing this afternoon is really about climate change technologies, also in Southeast Asia, where I present three cases, very brief cases. And there's been a lot of talk of transitions to sustainable development, and more specifically, green and climate change responsive technologies, which really are now quite ubiquitous. Climate change has become the single most pressing issue of our time. Well, apart, of course, from COVID-19, and I'm sure you're well aware of the massively tragic effects that climate change has had on our lives and livelihoods in very gender-specific ways, as well as putting the future of our planet at great risk overall. As a result, solutions and pathways have been examined and proposed. Climate change, mitigation, and adaptation strategies have been actually at the forefront and have gained the most traction among those measures that have been examined. And many of these strategies, as you see in this slide, are technological measures and programs. Many of these measures aim to transition to sustainability, but however celebrated they are as breakthroughs in this climate debacle, curiously, they are devoid of questions of social power and distribution. And on this point, there are three specific things that actually come to mind. First, the control of corporate giants on the global economy, pretty much what Kavita had described earlier, remains firmly intact and persistent. This capitalist growth-led accumulation model hovers over many of these climate programs, further widening the divide between the rich and the poor. The same setup has been seen to shift and adopt a green approach, however, without drastically altering wealth and profit accumulation goals. They capitalize on new and clean and green technologies that aim to reap and boost profits, but at the same time, continue to compromise fair wages and social protection, especially for those who add value to the economy and whose labor is continuously being extracted under cheap and flexible terms. Second point, new climate technologies, despite being represented as neutral, are themselves social processes, which may initiate or exacerbate social exclusions that support patriarchal and elite capture, or may place even heavier burdens on the shoulders of the already poor and marginalized. Introducing technologies are socially embedded processes, and they may sidestep or exacerbate wealth, power, and knowledge hierarchies. In other words, though climate change responsive technologies are often described in terms of technological innovation, and can promise new green jobs, they are still intimately tied to the political, social, and cultural institutions that continue to create and sustain social inequalities. Third point, gender as it intersects with other axes of identity and power, such as class, ethnicity, race, age, and ability, shapes the exclusionary and unjust effects of these technologies, which thus may foment conflict and unrest. The forces driving both climate change and political unrest are structural and originate in the patriarchal capitalist economic system that subsists on exploitation and extractivism of vital natural resources. Today, as I said, I am coming especially from the perspective of these climate responsive technologies that emanate from the narrative of achieving a clean and green and decarbonized society and world. While these technologies are framed as harmless and beneficial, they may also be sowing the seeds of discontent and unrest and can exacerbate situations of already growing insecurity and marginalization. My first case is that of Vietnam, and these are two out of these three cases I've been sort of minimally involved in as a researcher. And in Vietnam, from 2014 to 2016, they've experienced the worst drought in 90 years, with 52 out of 63 provinces affected. This emphasized the government's need for reliable forecast information about rainfall and drought. To address this challenge, a consortium of GIS specialists based in Bangkok, and one of them, a partner, was SEI, worked with Vietnam's Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Development, or MARD, to develop a geospatial tool which will enable local agencies to prepare for and respond to droughts, applying these to two pilot communes in the province of Ninh Thuan. Farmers there are generally not considered as decision makers in climate change adaptation by government authorities. Instead, they are made to rely on administrative decisions and are considered as disaster victims or passive recipients of emergency assistance. So there's a very paternalistic relationship between local groups and authorities, government authorities. For the women farmers themselves in one of the communes, many activities actually require for them long-term forecasts. And one of them actually said that if they knew that in 3 months, things would be dry and would dry up, for instance, they would therefore know that they would have to store water, dig deeper ponds, or shift to short-term or drought-resistant food crops such as beans, cucumbers, melons, and vegetables. The government is now urging farmers to actually abandon their traditional paddy rice agriculture and instead to resort to cultivating mung beans and other drought-resistant cash crops. Farmers, especially indigenous groups like the Raglay, resist this because, as one of them said, the soil in Phu Ha commune is not suitable for crops other than paddy. The government thinks that their resistance is due to a lack of knowledge of new crops. The farmers, however, had no choice but to comply with the decision, as this was represented to them as part of the agricultural development plan for the province, which was intended to boost farm trade guided by the new drought forecasting tool. In 2018, the Provincial Department of Hydrometeorology forecasted that the dry spell would last until August, but the rain came in June and destroyed the mung beans, which led to huge losses for the farmers. To reduce the burden of crop loss for the farmers, the government compensated roughly $130 per hectare of failed crop. The compensation, however, covered only 15% of the cost that the farmers had invested. That's a photo of a very dry reservoir in this commune, in this province. The next case is that of Indonesia. The World Bank introduced the use of public-private partnerships, or PPP, in Indonesia several years ago, which opened access for the private sector to build energy infrastructure through concessions and auctions. PPPs also ensure that the private sector, both domestic and multinational corporations, get a large portion of the energy generated in comparison to the public sector. The Mount Talang area on the slide there has been established as a protected area because of its important function of water catchment. This means that no permit can be issued there, but the geothermal law of Indonesia provides an exception for geothermal exploration and exploitation. The government facilitates the obtaining of permits, ensures security guarantees by its civil and military apparatuses, and access to exploration in protected forest areas. The Ministry of Energy and Mineral Resources unilaterally designated Mount Talang and its surrounding areas as geothermal concessions, which was offered to investors through an auction process. Much of this process was also male-dominated, totally sidestepping the fact that customary land law among the Minangkabau indigenous people, or the local inhabitants, is matrilineal, where land tenure decisions are traditionally in the hands of women. The permit for exploration and exploitation will run for 37 years. This, however, was issued without a proper process of consultation with communities, which in turn triggered protests since there was no free, prior, and informed consent. However, in reality, the communities were being urged to approve this project by arguing that it was part of a national strategic project. Communities in Mount Talang basically raised the question: if our environment, land, water, sources, air, and livelihoods is being destroyed and polluted by geothermal exploration and exploitation, how can this energy be called clean? Clean for whom? And why are we not being heard at all in this process? Subsequently, the state used militias to quell the protests. There you have a photo. 3 people were imprisoned on charges of provocation against the geothermal project. They were sentenced to 3 years and 6 months. This has made the community back down. This has not made the community back down. In fact, they were more energized, and they have since filed a lawsuit against the Ministry of Energy and Mineral Resources, which unilaterally designated their villages and land as geothermal working areas. The third brief case is on the Philippines, in Manila in the Philippines. It has to do with, the goal for achieving clean transport and reducing emissions. Electrification of public utility vehicles plays a vital role in the transition towards a more sustainable transport system by reducing air pollution and dependence on fossil fuels. There are around 270,000 public utility vehicles or PUVs in the Philippines, and the jeepney, the one on your left, being a refurbished version of the American road jeeps, the most popular. The government aims to employ around 200,000 electric jeepneys or e-jeepneys with the following incentives: 5% subsidy for each unit, 6% interest rate for loan purchase payable in 7 years, an equity subsidy of $1,500. Despite these incentives, jeepney operators and drivers are still hesitant to adopt them due to high investment and operational costs, lack of technical and policy support and public acceptance, lack of charging infrastructure, and they actually doubt the availability of vehicle parts and charging stations. A unified nationwide organization of drivers and operators under the umbrella of the organization called Piston leads resistance to the government's plan to modernize old jeepneys and to replace them with more eco-friendly models. The head of Piston, George San Mateo, a driver for 30 years, says that, and I quote, a driver makes about 500 to 600 pesos or $11 for 2 days. Earnings depend on factors such as profitability of the route, passenger volume, seating capacity. Top-of-the-line jeepneys today would cost about $11,000 to $13,000. The new model the government wants us to purchase vehicles about $30,000 to $35,000. He says and warns that the costs to run and maintain these models will be passed on to commuters. And that's why he says there's a deadlock. We have no choice but to fight back and launch transport strikes and transport protests. So you have the photo over there. What we want in a modernization, he says, is that the framework should be socially just, democratic, public service oriented, and its long-term perspective should be the nationalization of public transport. But the government doesn't want that. In 2018, San Mateo was arrested for leading a 2-day nationwide transport strike in October, and the government has filed a case against him in connection with the strike. What do these 3 cases tell us of the unforeseen outcomes of climate change adaptation and mitigation technologies? From the cases, we saw technologies heavily associated with masculinity, policies that favor expert knowledge that prioritize the trajectory of economic growth through cash cropping, using drought technologies, but which are denied smallholder farmers because they are deemed dependent and unknowledgeable, encroachment on land for clean energy concessions, and a reconfiguring of gender and ethnic relations and their land rights. E-transport vehicles that threaten jobs already dangerous, cheap, and insecure, despite the value that these jobs add to the local economy through people's mobility on a daily basis. This point to me a few insights and conclusions. First, climate responsive solutions are often masculinity influenced technical fixes. They consider the wicked problem of climate change as a manifestation of unruly nature. And some of us researchers might be aware that during the Enlightenment period in Western civilization, nature has been largely understood as a phenomenon standing out there to be studied, fixed, extracted, and controlled through scientific and disciplinary practices for economic ends. Nature is intended for human gain and exploitation, and when nature becomes uncontrollable and unruly, science also needs to step in yet again to make it intelligible in order to control it as a masculine practice, such as in the drought forecasting efforts in the Vietnamese case. They're also found in the dominant discourses of sustainable development, especially in its original view of overcoming the limits of economic growth by realizing a pathway of green economic initiatives and programs. It is this same dichotomous view of nature and society that deploys technical solutions to climate change problems without addressing the deeper social, economic, and political causes of such problems in the first place. This in turn demonstrates growing blindness to the inequitable power system that can account for both unsustainable environmental practices and the unequal distribution of benefits and disproportionate costs being borne by vulnerable people and communities. Second point, there seems to be a narrow understanding of vulnerability, as it's often used now in climate change circles, as only vulnerability to climate change, such as in the Vietnamese case where farmers face the risk associated with drought. There is no recognition of the systemic and contextual political, economic, and cultural drivers of vulnerability. For instance, their knowledge is unable to stand up to expert knowledge and their unfavorable economic capacities to absorb farm losses from projects initiated by the government. The jeepney drivers, West Sumatran farmers, and Vietnamese farmers are not opposing clean and green advancements per se. They are opposing the blindness to the worsening aggravations that these technologies may cause on their already existing vulnerabilities, which may not be due only to climate change. And last and third, these interventions are actually top-down measures whose underlying technologies are masculinized technological and market-driven advancements. As such, the science and technology behind climate change mitigation and adaptation measures may grossly sidestep the contexts where they land. Contexts heavily defined by everyday social and gender inequities, which they can induce or even worsen. The design and deployment of renewable energy systems, such as the geothermal concessions in West Sumatra, occur in contexts defined by already existing marginalization of indigenous groups. Inequalities embedded in incumbent fossil fuel production systems can persist in their replacements, especially if women and other marginalized groups are still excluded from decision-making and the benefits of a just energy transition. As a result, this can provoke resistance and unrest and a misleading narrative that these groups are anti-green, anti-development, or anti-clean. What we are increasingly learning from these measures is that we should not assume that going green and clean is just. A paradigm shift, one firmly based on social justice, care, and recognition of the interdependent relationship between people and nature, and not an exploitative one, is really now more crucial than ever. This is a matter of urgency, especially if we are to realize a pathway for sustainable peace and environmental security. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Babette. That was such a comprehensive look at such a complex problem, and obviously articulated so well with the points that Kavita was bringing to our attention. I feel like there are about 83 things that I would like to follow up from these presentations. Let me just say to the people who have come into the audience to please go ahead and use the Q&A function to send in your questions. And first we're going to have, while we're collecting them, we're going to have some discussion just amongst the panelists. So Babette and Kavita, I assume that like me, when you were listening to each other, you had things that you were thinking about. So let me turn to you first and ask whether there are either questions or follow-up points that you would like to bring to each other.
Babette, would you like to go first, or I have a pressing question?
Well, go ahead. But
Okay.
yeah, I'll follow. Yeah.
Babette, thank you so much. It's you know, when you put the injustices by using real examples, it makes it even more challenging than what we initially, you know, just read through research and from the news, because we get to really understand from those that are most impacted. So it's the farmers, it's the women, it's, you know, the jeepney drivers. I'm actually quite curious to know that, you know, the corporations that are bringing in these tech solutions into Asia, you know, who are they? Are they, you know, are they companies from Asia? Are they transnational corporations? You know, can you share with me, you know, who brings in this technology?
Great, thanks. Well, for instance, in the Indonesian case, as far as I know, it's actually a consortium of a Turkish multilateral company that's actually trying to do the exploration and exploitation in this area of Mount Sumatra. And it's shall we say, it's an interesting feature that the government actually provides a very enabling environment for these kinds of investments to come in, to actually exempt, you know, protection permits for this purpose, especially for geothermal exploration and exploitation. And often the discourse being used is that these are not harmful. In fact, they advance the goals of sustainable development, these green and clean energy that can be harnessed. So with reference to your question, I think it shows my age also. There was a time when we thought that, well, it would be actors, corporate actors from the global north actually coming in and sort of bringing in all these investments, these new technologies, this whole transfer of what we call to be technical knowledge, or what they call to be technological diffusion. But I think now it's a much more complex picture, that we have a coalition, a coalescing of actors. We have, for instance, in this case, it was a coalescing of a private company within Indonesia, of course, the government, and of course, a foreign partner, a foreign corporate partner. I would say the same for hydropower. For instance, there is now increasing attention towards, and again in Southeast Asia, along the Mekong region, we see, for instance, countries within the Asian region, Thailand, China, Malaysia, all involved in building and constructing and going through the whole process of several dam projects, hydropower projects in Laos, PDR. So it's a much more complex picture now, whereas I think there was a time that the biggest sort of shall we say, promoter of these huge infrastructure and technology measures would be the World Bank. And there was a moratorium overall vis-a-vis, let's say, huge infrastructure projects like hydropower. But that is no longer the case now.
Right. Right. I mean, and that shows, I mean, because you see the global South countries coming to spaces like COP and really, almost refusing to shift to clean renewable energy or, reduce, especially countries such as Indonesia, Korea, India and China, refusing to, limit their emissions on the grounds that they are still developing. And there is a right, because they are still developing, but you can see that even the countries in the global South are actually using the policy spaces to push development as the reason for really not, going clean and green in a just and sustainable manner. And it's really interesting, and this is why I was very curious to know, because I now I'm starting to understand just how culpable the global South is in terms of, really being entrenched in the whole boosting your economies through market-based mechanisms, and in the introduction of tech climate fixes and then partnering with foreign companies. But really, a lot of it is now being led by the corporations and the governments within this region as well. And so there is a responsibility on the governments in this region as well to really step up. And this is where I think the challenge lies, because what I want to talk about in terms of the accountability of governments in this region. We don't even have a regional human rights commission. We don't even have human rights commissions in most of the countries. How do you hold governments in this region accountable?
No, it's really interesting. Like with the ASEAN, with the what does ASEAN stand for non-ASEAN audiences? Association of Southeast Asian, Association of Southeast Nations. That's a regional, the regional formation of Asian and Southeast Asian countries. They does not have a strong human rights program or component. And to think the human rights violations are completely, I mean, they're violated left, right, and center in all these countries, as we see now, especially as you said in your talk earlier about the rise of authoritarianism in these countries. I also wanted to pursue, I mean, from your discussion, Kavita, first of all, I enjoyed it very much. You really provided the big picture. I mean, I could, as you were speaking, I could really sort of situate the things that I would be sharing next within the bigger picture that you presented, that you provided all of us. So I see a lot of connections and a lot of alignment between what you said and the cases that I shared. But I was just also thinking in terms of, where are the pockets of hope or the pockets of breakthroughs? Can we locate them? Are they gaining traction? Are they, shall we say, are there alternatives that we can sort of really, pursue? That would be something. I'd invite you to further share.
You know what, you're absolutely right. I think we need to inject some hope and enthusiasm, because our presentations have been so stuck. And so look, when I was working at APWLD, and you're aware of this, we undertake the Feminist Participatory Action Research. And what that means is that we work with grassroots women across the region to really use this research as a tool for political activism. And so what we've done is, we run a, we don't call it a program or a project, but it's actually working with these grassroots women, for a period of like 24 months to up to 3 years. And, so I used to run the climate justice program. And so I worked in the area of feminist climate justice. And, each of these action research would have a theme. So currently, the grassroots women who we're working with in the communities are looking at gender safeguards in NDCs. Do they even exist? How are they going to be implemented, and so forth? So, but before that, what we looked at was loss and damage in the region, and there is an upcoming report on the findings. And what we found is that once we've engaged at the grassroots level with the people and the women particularly who are the worst impacted, when they have the knowledge, when they are informed of how climate change is exacerbating their existing inequalities and discrimination, the mobilization that takes place, with grassroots communities who have very little, but these women we found have mobilized and really, gone into political spaces, have demanded, and they've shaped their demands themselves in terms of what they'd like to see. And obviously, we provide the technical support, the knowledge tools, and the resources for them to be able to do this. And so over that time, and we work with young women researchers from the communities as well. So they work directly with the communities, and we don't, the tools that we use is not like it's through storytelling, it's through sharing experiences, they develop it themselves. And these demands include things such as participatory democracy. So what we've seen is these women are now stepping up in, their community leadership roles. The panchayat in India, a woman being elected as a community leader in Cambodia. And because they have this understanding of what climate injustices are, they are shaping the narrative of what the government authorities need to do to shape and change things in the community. So looking at gender violence, looking at alternatives such as agroecology, investment in commons,
Wonderful.
energy democracy, where it's locally owned and locally driven. So there's a number of just feminist climate solutions, nature-based solutions, and including moving into just and equitable transition. A lot of things are actually being done on the ground by the indigenous communities, by the grassroots communities, if they have the right support from their government, and including a lot of, the foreign aid and organizations such as us that are working to really promote this. The problem is, I don't think we just see enough of those stories being shared in the spaces. These stories are hijacked by the larger tech corporations coming in with their tech solutions, smart agriculture, and all of this, RED plus. It actually overtakes the things that we need to be doing and that we are doing, but obviously it's not at that scale that we need, particularly with like nature-based solutions and agroecology. And these have to be the ones that are actually coming from the communities themselves rather than the ones that are being imposed through corporations. So we do have these pockets of really good stories where we do see change happening in countries. But yeah, I mean, there's so much more work that's still left to be done to really change the system.
Sure.
Yeah.
Carol, we're turning it over to you, or do you want us to continue?
You are welcome to continue. If when you get tired of that, you can turn it back to me.
Yeah, okay. I just wanted to pick up what Kavita said regarding this pockets of change and these breakthroughs. And this is, I think, where really, as you already said, scale really matters. I mean, how do we scale up and out all these initiatives, And I think we are caught in some kind of politics of scale, whereby those who occupy a particular scale are much more visible than those on other scales. And I think that's something that we have to be conscious of, and we have to sort of rectify, sort of correct, shall we say. When are the grassroots scales going to be much more visible? When can they really matter? And when can their voices really be heard? Just my thoughts there.
Yeah, no,
Okay.
and you're absolutely right, Babette, because this is what we find. We go into, international spaces where we're hoping for oversight and change and resources and, the transfer of technology and capacity building, whatever that was promised in the Paris agreements. We go to these spaces and we find that these spaces are completely overrun by Shell, by some Norwegian companies, by some Canadian mining companies. They're all there, with their green pamphlets and their solutions, and their tech market-based options, really just almost overtaking the indigenous groups, the youth groups, the women and gender groups, those groups, those of us that are there to actually push for a degrowth agenda that then looks at sustainability and safe ecological solutions. And this is where I think these convening, there's something very wrong in these convening spaces where we are actually being barred. In Madrid, they actually shut us out completely. I think everybody who follows this knows what happened. There was 1,000 of us left outside in 4 degrees. Just shut us out, when the UN General Secretary is speaking inside. And I'm sure he knew what was going outside. And yet nothing was being done. In fact, we were the ones that were kettled out of there. So this is the problem. This is the problem in terms of those of us working in the civil sector are resisting, are going into these spaces with very limited resources, facing language barriers, all of this in these spaces, and yet we're not giving the space to engage. Even with CSW and Beijing and other UN spaces, we are allowed to observe only. Or one person is allowed to go in and make an intervention for 2 minutes. How do we effect change in these spaces? Which is why I think a lot of the work that we have now started really digging into is how do we make differences at the national level, despite, the challenges and the lack of independence that we find. And the key to this is really to find allies. I've seen this happen, and I've worked with it. You are able to find allies with governments, with political parties, with even private sector. There are allies who are committed to ensuring that there is a sort of human rights centered solution that is being, or interventions that are being developed together, using these voices. And because through the feminist participatory action research, this is where we see a lot of the changes really happening. It's like when the grassroots communities have actually entered into these policy-making spaces where they have a voice, and then they hold the policymakers accountable to their demand, you really do see a change in not just the legislation and policies, but in the implementation, in how the governments are actually giving, gender budgeting to protecting national forests. Like we have some amazing examples, even countries such as Pakistan, the women have managed to go and meet with the Minister of Climate Change, who also happens to be a woman. And, and this woman minister basically just said, right, the landlords are not going to do this, and we're going to protect this much forest and no more logging. And it happened. So there is that, and it really just comes to speaking truth to power. And that, and this is where, it is so important for civil societies to be fully involved, meaningfully participating in these spaces to effect the changes. And right now the challenge is, because everything is confined to this technological world, you cannot, and our grassroots communities cannot access this space. So this is what we really need to think about, this new challenge that we now have in this COVID world. How do we continue to do that work being confined as we are now? Yeah.
Great, thanks, Navita. I mean, that's it from my side. I don't know if you have anything else to comment on or to.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like we could talk for a while, but Carol, I think I'd be really looking forward to sort of getting the questions from the audience and sharing more.
Great. Well, let me ask one follow-up question to what you were just talking about.
Sure.
And then we'll turn to the audience. So there are so many different dynamics that the two of you have been describing, but just to focus on one of them, we have this predominant turn to technologies as though they are going to, both as though they are going to solve these problems and also as though they are neutral and not both socially constructed and having social impacts all the way through. And I think that that's a really important part of what you've been talking about, is that, you can't think about something as a green technology at the moment it is producing energy, right? It's about everything that goes into it before it does, while it's doing it, and after. But anyway, you have, this turn to these technologies and the irony that if you try to talk about locally based solutions, if you try to talk about agroecology, nature-based solutions, part of what you hear is, well, the problem is so urgent, right? This problem that we have caused is so urgent that now you have to rely on us because we have the scale of response that the urgency demands, right? So you're going to find the solution in exactly the same kind of thinking that led to the problem. But this issue of scale is something that is in fact really important. And the question of, the thing I want to push both of you on now is, if we really believe that the best solutions come from local communities, come from indigenous communities, come from women who have been working the land for generations and so on, and they are in fact local and specific kinds of solutions, what can we do at a policy level to invest in the possibility of the development and implementation of those solutions at a scale that actually would make a big difference? And so I don't mean by saying that, how do we, replicate one solution someplace else, because we know they are local, but there is something beyond the kind of pitiful resources that are made available to any of these communities now that are working on coming up with their own solutions that we could be doing. So if you were the global development justice or climate transformation czar, what kinds of policies, or at a national level, what kinds of policies could you put into place that would make it possible to have these incredibly important, creative, and ecologically sustainable solutions that local communities come up with be much further developed and exist much more widely throughout a country, let's say?
That's a really tough one.
That's why I asked you.
Yeah. Can I just, I mean, so I actually have quite a simple answer as well, which is, what Babette and I were talking about earlier in terms of the lack of promotion of the solutions that are actually working, solutions that are just feminist, are based on, indigenous sovereignty. We are just not hearing as much about it because we're overtaken by electric cars and so forth. And this is where I think the role of the media is also so important. And what we're accessing, all of us have smartphones and we literally go onto social media and we are inundated with information, but that information is all, going towards profiting social media companies, tech industries, and Rupert Murdoch. And this here again is how, our choices are being influenced at the same time. So we, those of us who are actually working in this space, are aware of, some very successful things that are happening in the region, yet we don't have the platforms available to actually promote that, so that these are the things that are actually being understood, that there is greater awareness about it to effect change. And this even applies to countries in the global north where, investment in commons is becoming a very common thing, whether it's communal garden patches to greening your infrastructure, these things work. And yet we don't really hear about this happening at a grander scale because, again, the media is hijacked by corporations, ensuring that their corporate products are being advertised and marketed far more than the ones that are not. And this is where I think state intervention is critical, because the governments, as duty bearers, have the responsibility to really commit to what they pledge to in terms of, their climate commitments. And this is really not happening. And the problem, comes down to corporate capture of all the spaces and not having an accountability on corporate capture. We're still negotiating the International Treaty on Business and Human Rights. God knows how long that's going to take and if that's going to happen. So what is it? What is it that we need to do to really bring to light an awareness of grassroots and indigenous solutions that are working? Media is one that I can think of how they can access these communities. Finding allies in the private sector, within governments, as I shared earlier, is another one. I think creating spaces is perhaps independent of the ones that are existing, so that there is that independence and there is no corporations coming into influence. A space, and I think in Brazil, with the Buen Venir and all of this movements, I think they're doing an amazing job of really pushing for, an alternative economic model that is based on degrowth, that is based on a sustainable economy, that is, based on agroecology and nature-based solutions, where you have women leading many of these projects quite successfully, and having the mobilizing among those of us that are actually working for the common good and the common fight is to really strengthen our own mobilization with these movements, to help get these solutions and these ideas, and even shape the interventions at the level that we really need. And I think it has to start at the national and, working with the grassroots communities at the national level is where we can see some incredible changes. And you can see this happening in the global north countries. People are changing their attitudes towards the climate crisis. Even in this region, we see a massive shift in the understanding and awareness of climate crisis as a threat to human security. So we really have to now align the middle class in most of these countries, who are sort of very much consumed by their long working hours and mortgage debt repayments and so forth, because again, trapped in a system, right? But how do we get these individuals, and we can see this happening, but really how to get them even more involved with the climate solutions rather than the ones that are being peddled through mainstream media, our consumer society.
Babette, do you want to speak to that?
I can just only complement it by saying that there are, and for me as a researcher and as a scholar, what sort of is now currently driving my attention is, these initiatives that are probably rather dispersed, but we hear about them. The Buen Vivir, for instance, in Brazil, convivial living is another one, conviviality, and the food sovereignty movement, the community economies. The problem is, how do we I used the term earlier, coalesce our efforts to actually bring visibility to what these movements are actually putting forward, the kind of alternatives they are posing. They weren't here before. I mean, years ago, when we were out on the streets and protesting hydropower, dictatorships, and everything else. But now there are really creative efforts to to again recognize this very strong interdependence and ties between nature and society, between the human and the non-human. Especially my cat is just all over the place. Yeah, talking of human and non-human. So I think, yeah, that's it. Certainly our institutions, and one of them is media, as Kavita has mentioned. But also, since I'm in the education sector, I am witnessing a whole new generation of students who are very aware of these issues. I am so pleased at least the students the young generation that I'm meeting now, that they are so aware of, the issues of injustice, even if they come from the global north. In Southeast Asia, you find, for instance, the youth sort of, joining ranks across countries to actually demand democracy and justice. I think these are gaining traction. And I think we just sort of have to push and enable it as much as we can, wherever location we are, wherever we're sitting, and in which spaces we engage.
Thank you so much. So spaces we engage, I'm going to turn to Melissa and ask Melissa to come in with the questions that are coming in from the audience.
And I will just say, if people do have questions, please go ahead and throw them in. But so I think one of the questions that came in really did kind of speak to, I think, a little bit of what you both have already said about media. But I wanted to raise it again because it was an interesting question, and also I think kind of exploring what some of the options are as another one popped into my head. So the question was from an anonymous attendee, and it said, how might both of your messages be heard by a wider audience such that Asia Pacific governments and more cannot so easily ignore the nexus between a failed economic system and possible exacerbation of those inequities by clean tech solutions? Some kind of celebrity wrangling for the greater good, e.g. the Extinction Rebellions of the world, etc. And obviously people like Greta Thunberg and many other sort of celebrity figures come into mind. And then the thing that popped into my head when I saw that question was also, like, when Twitter blocks someone like our former president, and what a sort of significant change happens in the sort of in the discourse and the dialogue. And such an action, I mean, like, I don't know what the possibilities of the extent of that are, but I see people, being blocked by Shell on Twitter and going into these sort of back and forth and kind of the role that again, this domination of the corporations in all of these media spaces, that's controlling the narrative, but then, someone gets shut off and all of a sudden it's like, okay, there's this empty space that all of these alternatives get to fill. And so that, I'm just throwing it in as like a kind of general question. I don't know if you have anything more to say about some of the different avenues or strategies that that come with this idea of promoting the sort of media piece of this. But I'll put that out there first.
Thanks, Melissa. I mean, I wish we had clear-cut answers to all of this, but what I can say, because I can see this happening, is that no matter how much our media is being controlled and surveilled, the creativity of the resistance movement is unbelievable. And this particularly rests with the youth of our generation, who do find alternative ways of really going around the loopholes and ensuring, that we continue to mobilize and organize and resist climate injustices. And there are still a number of, obviously smaller, independent news outlets that a lot of us do rely on. And yes, they're being censored, the journalists are being picked up. I mean, even Al Jazeera, hasn't been left alone. So we know what is happening, but we also know, given the work that we do, the difference between what is right, false information, and what isn't, right? And I know for a fact that, false information tweets 6 times higher on Twitter than, you know, the truth. And that's because, you know, I'm sure everybody has watched The Social Dilemma on Netflix, and that really explains that, you know, false information actually makes money, which is why, despite knowing better, this is what is being promoted. And so this is a huge problem. And this is something that, you know, we are now shaping into our advocacy strategies to really try and tackle. And I know we're going to be able to do this because we have the right sort of tech geeks and millennials and youth, you know, working on our side to really now start challenging and creating safe spaces for us to engage and share what we can. And, you know, I think India is a really good example to look at what's happening. You know, there is so many independent media outlets that produce extremely important information, and they're being censored and quashed, and yet it is still making international news. We know what is happening. We are providing the support we can to ensure that, you know, whatever is happening is actually being shared. So there is some accountability. You know, no government likes to look bad in international media. No government wants to look as if they're violating human rights or, you know, not protecting the freedom of expression and so forth. So they come up with this whole thing about regulating because of cyberbullying and trolling, which is just a false pretense of really going after the real information. That so India is, and Naomi Klein recently wrote an article on The Intercept as well around this issue. And you know, and has responses from Indian media outlets about, you know, how they see they can challenge the increasing number of legislations that are being passed to control and regulate independent and free media. So an interesting case to see, you know, how it's going to go and where it's going to go. And we all know the case about that young climate activist who was targeted simply because she made a social media toolkit. So you can see how dangerous, you know, even these spaces are. For activists and how they're picked up. But again, this was something that was shared so widely across the international media. There was so much outrage, you know, and thankfully the justice system, you know, did the right thing by just saying this was just a false charge and really targeting and hounding environment activists and so forth. So, you know, there's a lot of challenges, but there are also wins that are coming along the way. And I think, you know, surely, given, you know, there's always those of us who are watchdogs and working on this side who will ensure that there is as much resistance as there is against corporate takeover.
Kavita, did you want to say anything to that either? Or should I go to the next?
No, I just wanted to add that certainly a lot has to be done, and much is desired with respect to how the established media can actually support, you know, our advocacies, our stories, and the kind of breakthroughs that you know that are happening all around. But what I'd like to also call attention to is, of course, it's again easier said than done, because sometimes it can be very tricky because the language of the social movements, at least I'm witnessing, is pretty much being co-opted, is pretty much being used. Green vocabularies, for instance, empowering women has been used by big corporations, and that is captured by media. And so media might come back to us and say, hey folks, we've been covering all these things you've been asking for. You know, so it's in a sense, we have to be very keen and skillful and alert at distilling the messaging, I would say.
Yeah, a bit.
Absolutely.
Spot on.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to go to the next question from the audience, which is from Stephanie Buchler. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. And she says, in Nepal, benefits and profit sharing were incorporated as a result of local pressure, especially by women, into run-of-the-river hydropower projects. And what role do you think
that something like that could play in the geothermal project you described in Southeast Asia? I think that's directed towards Babette. And what limitations does that approach present?
Yeah, hi Stephanie, I've read your work and totally a fan of your work on feminist political ecology of water. Yes, benefits and profits sharing were incorporated as a result of local pressure. For me, I think it can be, something like that can actually be used for as long as, and I think Kavita mentioned this earlier, for as long as it is in the terms defined by the people themselves, of those who are the beneficiaries themselves, that it is not something that is sort of top down or imposed, but rather something that they themselves define as their own terms of transacting. I think in this case, this would be a success story whereby, you know, they define the agenda and they define how they want to protect their run of the river hydropower projects. There are also, going back to Indonesia, there is a case, apart from this geothermal case, of a mini hydropower project, also in an adjacent village in the same island of West Sumatra, and I mean, not island, province of West Sumatra. And it was actually an experience of the people themselves, the community themselves coming together, knowing their power needs, their electricity needs. They came up with a mini hydropower facility that would serve their needs. So again, where is it? The basic question I think has to be fundamentally asked: for whom and for what? Thank you, Stephanie.
Absolutely. And then I think Paula Raymond had just asked, and she framed it as concrete next steps, and I don't know, you know, concrete or not, but in terms of someone's individual kind of working at this intersection at the nexus of gender justice and economic justice and climate justice, if you were going to give a recommendation to people on like a way to get involved, some kind of concrete next step for them to kind of take action after this webinar, what might you suggest that people look into or read or do?
For me, I think particularly those of you that are, have signed on from the Global North countries, there is a lot of value behind the Green New Deals, as long as they're decolonial and feminist. And I know out of US and UK, there are feminist Green New Deals that are being proposed. Have a look at them. Look at the entry points, because it really aligns with the development justice and the alternative economic growth model, degrowth model that we've been talking about. And again, it's like the Grand Marshall Plan. Like after the war, there was the Grand Marshall Plan. And now because of all these multiplying crises, we have the Global Green New Deal versus the Great Reset, which is also now being pushed by the usual economists and Davos and World Economic Forum and so forth. So you can see that there's these two packages that are now at the forefront of tackling our crises. Look at both. And it does become quite apparent. And this is where you really need to have this checklist of, are these solutions replicating the current system, which is, your electric vehicles are going to be made by extracting the metal and minerals from the global south using cheap labor. So, again, so that's not a solution. That's not a solution for, it might be a solution for the global north, but it's not going to be a solution for global south, because it's just going to push in whatever that's happening. So this is where you need to have a really good understanding of, and it's never about taking individual responsibility, because we're all trapped in the same system. It really is about challenging that system collectively, to think of the solutions at a community level where we are all connected. And this is why the global Green New Deal is probably the best way to look at things rather than just simply the stuff that is coming out nationally, because I'm pretty certain, and there was a recent publication, and I and a number of activists from across the world have authored this, and it's really perspectives on the global Green New Deal. I'll just share it, and they're short article pieces because there were so many of us writing about this. I wrote about, does the global Green New Deal work for women's unpaid care work in the global South? So these are some of the things that you can take on to see whether these solutions are the ones that you should work towards in your communities, in your spaces, in research, academia, artists, and so forth. Because they are many entry points, and because it's a deal that covers all sector. So this is people working in transport, agriculture, housing, science, technology, and so forth. So for me, I think that is a possible way of moving forward as a concrete next step of what's available out there.
Thank you. Babette, did you want to say anything, or should I move to the next?
Yeah, it's fine. You can move to the next. Thanks.
Okay, so this next one is from Marina Kunskova, who's at GPAC. And she says, how do you understand prevention beyond conflict prevention in the context of environmental action and climate change? Is it part of the policy discourse? As a global network, GPAC has been working to support local community trainings on using environmentally friendly fuels and securing cultures in the context of displacement in the Pacific. However, the discourse mostly predominated by mitigation and is mostly predominated by mitigation and adaptation. I was wondering how to add prevention in the discussion.
Yeah. Yeah, Marina, I was wondering what you meant by prevention here. Could you elaborate a little bit? Is it prevention of?
I can actually go ahead, Marina, if you want. I can just promote you so that you can actually speak. Where there she is allowed to talk. You should be able to speak now. So if you want to elaborate on what you meant there.
Yeah, thank you so much. I got promoted. I feel very important. I guess, so we are a global network that works on prevention more broadly, right? Not necessarily the prevention of armed conflict, but also the prevention of climate change, perhaps, right? And one of the issues that currently has been kind of part of the conversation with some of the UN partners is what really prevention means in the context of climate change. Can we really talk about the prevention of climate change? And I guess given the more of a, I do not know if we want to call it radical ideas that have been raised today in the conversation, but can we really think about turning the clock? And is that even, I guess, a policy support or programmatic support for turning that clock, and how, if so, that could be done? Like maybe more, I guess the question is both on whether there is a policy support in this area, but also whether there is like some specific local actions that you could bring into the conversation as an example. Thank you.
Well, Marina, I must confess, I'm not familiar with the discourse of prevention, and I should learn more about it. Perhaps I'm a victim of the dominance or the hegemonic positioning of adaptation and mitigation, considering that I'm, sort of as a researcher, this is what gets to me as I look at adaptation efforts, for instance, or mitigation efforts like renewable energy. But yeah, I mean, I would really like to, I'd be interested to really explore this idea of prevention. Is it anywhere closer to the idea of mitigating climate change? And I think, as you correctly ask, I mean, can we really turn the clock back? So I guess it's answering a question with a question.
Kavita, did you have anything that you wanted to say to that?
I'm with Babette on this one as well. This is the first time I'm hearing prevention in the climate terminology that we're so used to. So I'd be equally as interested to understand really and what the narrative is behind prevention.
Absolutely, it's something that is interesting to explore a little further. So at this point, I wanted to ask a question that I'm trying to figure out exactly the right way to phrase it, but I just recently saw an article that was about environmental governance of the Chinese Belt and Road initiative, and I think I'm not able to place it exactly in which part of the presentation, but sort of talking about the way that that it is, much more, I guess, on a national level where some of these investments are being driven, and that like this decentering from sort of the World Bank, the IMF, and then sort of the role that that countries that are south to south that are playing in sort of these investment projects, and then kind of starting to think about the accountability measures and environmental governance being the one that came up here. But I am curious in your work if this is something that has come up around the China Belt and Road project, specifically if it's something that's come up in other contexts in terms of environmental governance.
Well, from my perspective, having spent a number of years working for the Stockholm Environment Institute in Asia, I cannot speak for them, of course, but what I recall was that the issue of as researchers, and we are researchers. Stockholm Environment Institute is a research think tank. It was something that that requires much more exploration and much more information, largely because there's so much opaqueness at the moment. There are geopolitical issues involved. I think everybody's quite aware of that. But I suppose our response as environmental and social researchers is to really see what would be the implications on people and settlements and ecosystems as the Belt and Road project progresses. That would be our foremost concern. But for the moment, I can say it's not within my radar, at least my research radar, as yet, although it may be. But I am just faced with just overwhelming opaqueness on this. And that's, for the moment, that's what I can say about it.
Yeah, thank you.
Babette is very diplomatic. By using the word opaque, I was just going to say that the secrecy surrounding exactly how this is supposed to roll out is very obvious to most of us. And, this is something that not only affects Asia, but goes into the Pacific as well. And the Pacific at the moment is, being trampled by this geopolitical tussle between China, Taiwan, and US and its allies. And so, from seabed mining prospects to further extraction, and then we've got the BRI coming through the region as well, with very little information and all very secretive. And just going by the record of how we've received foreign aid in the region from, all partners really, whether it's the Chinese or other global South countries or the global North, all of it is tied. And I don't foresee any changes to that arrangement, even with the BRI. I'm inherently of the view that whatever it is, it's designed to make profit and not really about, gender equality, human rights, or environmental safeguards. They will tick the boxes, that's for sure. And a clear example, for instance, is, from Fiji. There was a lot of sort of celebration around the fact that Fiji government said there's going to be a moratorium on seabed mining, and it was seen as a great win, and what a great move for conserving the ocean and so forth. If you really peel back that moratorium applies to an area that doesn't even include where the seabed mining prospect licenses have already been given. So you see, It's really the manipulation of information by governments, working with, those who've received those licenses to tick the box, to show that, we are being committed to, but really this is where our role becomes so critical, is really peeling back those layers to really understand exactly what has been signed on to and what actions are being done. And I suspect all of us need to do this for the BRI as well.
Yeah. And then I think there's time for just one more question that came in from the audience before I turn it back over to Carol. But Meg Parrott asked, what do you think about the framework of climate resilience?
Would you?
No, I'm coming from shall we say, the debates in the research literature. I mean, it's often used, and honestly, there's a lot of debates around it. But I just would like to point out that resilience was a term that was actually coined by those working on ecosystems, on from the natural sciences and all that. It is really, technically speaking, sort of bouncing back of a system, a natural system that has encountered some kind of disruption, and it's bouncing back to its original state, or normal state of normalcy, shall we say. I found that a bit problematic when it comes to, for instance, looking at how communities' lives and livelihoods are actually disrupted by, flooding or long dry spells and droughts and storm surges, etc., and cyclones, largely because it sort of omits and sidesteps the idea that what is expected to bounce back, or the condition to return to, is something that is acceptable and normal and equal and just. And for me, that's where the resilience conversation sort of, when it started, actually sort of sidesteps. However, now there are different, again, going back to the research literature, there are different uses of the term resilience. People have actually connected the term equitable resilience, inclusive resilience, resilience building as a goal to ensure that people and communities are well equipped to deal with disasters and are able to adapt. So yeah, we just need to know how it is being used, and what purposes it serves. But good question there.
Yeah. Is there time for me, Melissa?
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, great. So, I share the same sort of reluctance around this word resilience. And I'll explain why. Because resilience puts this onus on those that are disproportionately impacted to find ways to adapt. And this is the thing around language, right? What we really need to look at is mitigation. And you will see across the board, there is so little action behind mitigation. And the only solution to really keeping our temperatures below 1.5 is to ban fossil fuels. That's mitigation. And we already know that at the rate we're going, we're going to be increasing our temperatures double, triple fold in our lifetimes. So again, because this resilience narrative, including adaptation, is the one that are taking the greatest space, because it's like, let us keep burning those fossil fuels and then let those being impacted deal with adaptation and resilience. And this is completely unfair and unjust. And I'm glad to hear Babette telling me that there's new language around it, equitable and sustainable resilience. But at the end of the day, we really need to look at what resilience entails. It entails the resources and the finances to be able to become resilient. And those of us, that are working, with the Green Climate Fund CSO working group, those of us that are engaged in spaces where we're still waiting for finances, are not seeing it really coming down to make much of a difference at the grassroots and local levels. And yet this language is the one that is being tendered in projects to, you know,
Right.
the GCF. And we're still negotiating on a separate line of funding entirely on loss and damages. I think what many of us get distracted from is to truly understand that the climate change impacts, both slow and rapid, have left communities in no position to adapt or become resilient. They have in fact been displaced. We don't even have an accurate number on the millions that have been displaced because of climate change impacts. You know, this language of resilience and adaptation really doesn't work for these displaced communities across the region. So really the resistance is behind mitigation, historical responsibility, and coughing up the finances needed for loss and damages. And these are the three controversial issues that somehow, you know, it is still being negotiated and fought over. And there is a co-option, using Babette's word, by, you know, even nature-based solutions. Again, you have to really look at what these nature-based solutions are. Where are they coming from? Is it, again, corporations? And it's the same with resilience, I think. So we have to be very careful about net zero, carbon offsetting, resilience, nature-based solutions, and all of this against, you know, that sort of human rights and Indigenous sovereignty checklist that we have. Thanks, Melissa.
Thank you. This is not your last chance to say anything, but I am going to turn it back over to Carol to sort of close this out and introduce the final thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa. Babette and Kavita, I am going to turn to you in a couple of moments to ask you the following. I'm giving you time to think about it. You have both given us such complex presentations and pictures here. I'm going to turn to you and ask you, what is the one main takeaway that you would really like the participants and our audience to go away with today? And while you think about it, I'm just going to say the last things that I have to say, so you can ignore me while I'm saying them. I want to remind everybody that there will be space to continue this conversation next week on April 15th at 9:30 a.m. On our panel on new economic paradigms for peace and the planet, intersectional feminist perspectives. We have a great group of panelists, and we hope that you'll join us, and it does follow directly on from a lot of the questions that have been raised today. I also want to remind those of you who, when you leave, of course, after our panelists' final thoughts, that that little survey will pop up, and it would be very helpful to us if you could complete it. And I'll also say that the chat function is going to go back on, and if you have resources that you would like to share with the other people who have been attending this webinar, that would be a great time to put it in. We'll leave the chat on for about 5 minutes after the official end of the webinar. So Kavita and Babette will be free to leave, but we'll stick around and give people a chance to add in anything that they want to. So all of that having been said, let me now turn to Kavita and Babette for the thoughts they would most like us to take away from today's conversation. Kavita, you want to go first?
Okay, I'll go first. Look, you know, fighting climate change is not limited to scientists, youths, or activists or academics. You know, one does not have to be an activist to take action. We really need to debunk our attitudes that convinces us that this is not our concern or our country. You know, I think we all recognize that there isn't much time left, but however we can take collective action, we can, you know, whether it is by making more informed choices, supporting locally owned activities, campaigns, investing in, you know, public commons and being part of it, stepping up to engage at the local political level, or even further, and for the artist, using art, poetry, music, creative expression, just to inform and speak on these issues, even with your family and friends, is a good start. I am truly of the view that if we're able to connect as a human community together and become a part of this momentum, we would be able to really make some real changes for a better future ahead. Thanks, Carol.
Thank you. Babette.
Yeah, thanks, Carol. I don't know what sort of really resonated with me all throughout this conversation this afternoon was the foundational positioning of the social justice agenda. I think it's just so important, whether it be in research, policy, in our advocacies. I think this is core. And my fear is that if we lose sight of this goal, it's just peril for the planet, peril for people, and I suppose peril for peace. For as long as we keep our eyes on that ball and bring things forward, take it forward, take the agenda of social justice forward, we can create those breakthroughs.
Babette, thank you so much. And I really want to thank both of you for these presentations that were so sharp and analytically insightful, and at the end of the day, inspiring in an area where it's pretty easy to get pretty despondent. So, and I also really want to thank you for the ways in which you engaged with each other's ideas and conversation, as well as with the audience. It's really been a great pleasure to have you here. And I think we're all going to go away with a lot of new ways of framing things and things that we want to think about further. So at this point, if we were in person, there would be a riotous standing ovation. I know that I am not the only one who really appreciated what you had to say. So that's definitely one of the unsatisfying things about Zoom, but really the warmest and most appreciative thanks for all that you have contributed to all of us who were here with you today. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Carol. It's been an honor, and lovely to meet you too, Babette. I hope we can stay in touch, and with you, Carol and Melissa, and the entire team for having me on board. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
I really enjoyed it too. And my cat Sam also says thank you. She's been listening.
We've been really happy to have the cat, I have to say.
Thanks, all of you.